Hey folks, in this video we're going to look at the fascinating history about how Irish street names have been censored down the ages. We're going to look at the history behind some of the rudest, strangest, and in many cases way too honest street names about what went on these streets in the past. You see, before the invention of Google Maps or street directories or even street signs, people had to navigate their way around Irish towns and cities using local knowledge. Now this led to lots of streets being named after what went on the street, or maybe a famous event that took place on the street. So for example, you get places like Cook Street, Butcher's Lane, Wine Tavern Street, Fish Amble Street. However, not all Irish streets were so innocently named. In this video, I'm going to take you to some of the strangest, rudest and eyebrow-raising in Irish history that have disappeared from our maps. We look at infamous places like the Bloody Bridge, Cutpurse Lane, and a few others that I'll mention later on but could get this video demonetized that relate to the world's oldest profession. It's a fascinating journey that takes us back to a time when Irish cities and streets looked very, very different. Now before we get into that, just let me introduce myself. My name is Fin Dwyer. I'm an Irish historian. I'm also the creator of the Irish History podcast. You'll find a link beneath this video. At the moment I'm doing a big series on the 1798 rebellion. It's a fascinating story. You'll find that linked beneath this video. But now let's get into the history behind some of the street names that have been censored from maps down the ages. Now let's kick off with something mild. So the term butt pops up in lots of towns and cities across Ireland. For example, even in Kilkenny today, there's a part of the city known as the Butts. In the Middle Ages, the city centre of Dublin was called Hogganbutts. But this name doesn't come from what you might think it comes from. It's actually to do with archery. So back in the Middle Ages, it was pretty much standard practice for the male population of Irish towns and cities to practice archery in case their city was attacked. And in order to become a good archer, people had to practice regularly. And this was done at a place called the Butts, where they'd have often two hills opposite each other, and people would go to the Butts and practice their archery, shooting arrows from one hill to the other. And that's where that term Butts comes from. But now let's move on to something a little more gritty, and Dublin's notorious Bloody Bridge. So back in the 17th century, a new bridge was built over the River Liffey. It would become known as the Barrack Bridge, because it connected one of the major barracks on the north side of the river to the south side of the river. But in Dublin, this was actually known as the Bloody Bridge. And this name arose because of the very violent origins of the bridge. So the bridge was built in the late 17th century, and at that time, most people crossed the river using ferries. And the ferrymen of Dublin were outraged that they were going to build this bridge because obviously it would undercut their business. And they actually attacked the construction site on several occasions. And on one occasion, several people were arrested and a major riot broke out and 4 people were killed. And after this, the bridge became known as the Bloody Bridge. Now later on, it would be rebuilt and its name would change. In the 19th century, it was the Victoria and Albert Bridge. Then in the 20th century, it became the Rory Og O'Moore Bridge, named after a 17th century rebel in Ireland. Now this is a nice segue into some of Dublin's more notorious street names, a lot worse than the Bloody Bridge, that was in many ways a warning sign to visitors of the city to keep away. So on early maps of Dublin, you'll find pretty notorious place names such as Cutpurse Lane, Cutthroat Lane, and even Murdering Lane. Now we can only speculate where these place names came from. So for example, Cutpurse Lane, we would have to imagine was a place where people were robbed on a frequent basis. Then Murdering Lane and Cutthroat Lane, again, we don't know exactly where they got that name from. I do have a theory that I'll share with you in a minute, but we can only imagine it must emerge from violent incidents that took place on that lane. Now, I think if we look at contemporary examples, we can maybe get an insight into where some of these names came from. So lots of you might be familiar with the fact that Limerick in the 80s and 90s was often referred to as Stab City. That's because there had been a couple of notorious incidents in the city, even though the murder rate in Limerick wasn't higher than anywhere else in Ireland. However, that name stuck, and I think this may well explain why these places in Dublin got this nickname. A notorious incident did take place on those streets, but the name stuck and they were forevermore known as that. Now next I want to move on to the world's oldest profession, because that does actually survive in place names all across Ireland. Now lots of Irish towns and cities, even today, have the place name Love Lane. Now historians have speculated as to where this name comes from. Many claim it was a place where lovers might go to kiss and cuddle. However, generally speaking, I think in a lot of places, this name actually arises from the fact that it was the red light district of a city. So for example, the Love Lane here in Waterford was located very close to the city docks. Oftentimes you'll find Love Lanes very close to army barracks, where unsurprisingly you'll also find large numbers of brothels. So that gives you some sense of where that name comes from. Now, while the term Love Lane might be sanitised and that has been able to survive into the modern period, there was also other less circumspect names. So for example, in Mullingar, there was a place called Slapdash Lane, and that was a well-known red light district in the town, but the name itself kind of alludes to it. Now next I want to move on to a couple of street names, some of which have survived, but most of which haven't, and you'll understand for obvious reasons why they haven't survived. One of the bleakest place names you'll find anywhere in Ireland is surely Misery. Now oddly, you'll find this in more places than you might imagine. So here in Waterford, just outside the city, there's a place called Mount Misery. In Dublin, there's a Misery Hill. That's where Facebook's headquarters are located today. But the history behind these places is fascinating, and there's a bit of debate exactly as to what they refer to, but generally it's thought that they are places that capital punishments, if we call it that, were carried out in the past. So in Dublin, Misery Hill is possibly where the bodies of people who had suffered a capital punishment were displayed as a warning to others. So here in Waterford, there was actually a gallows on Mount Misery. So you can get a sense about why some of these places carry that name. But they're not the only places in our landscape today that carry kind of associations with capital punishment. One of my favourite places, and I think I've mentioned this in a video before, is a place called Hammond Lane in Dublin today. Now Hammond Lane, you might think, oh, it's named after some guy called Hammond, but that's not the case. If you look at the sign on Hammond Lane today, so you see Hammond Lane on top, and then underneath it we have the Irish, which is Lorna an Cruchara, and the word Cruchara in Irish means hangman. So this was once Hangman's Lane, and over time it then became Hammond Lane. And this leads us on to why some of these place names have been changed over time. Because this is in some ways the most fascinating part of this story about why our place names have been sanitised over the last 200 years. Now lots of the place names I've mentioned in this video you just won't find in Irish towns and cities today. There's no Slapdash Lane in Mullingar today. But the reasons why these place names have disappeared are more complex than you think. So in some cases, I guess, there's no capital punishment carried out in Ireland today. But as we saw with Hammond Lane, there's also a bit of a gentrification process going on. People don't want to live on a street called Hangman's Lane, but they're much more comfortable living on a street name called Hammond Lane. And it's actually in the 19th century when we see a lot of these names being changed and disappearing from Irish maps. And actually, as I was preparing for this, in a book written in the early 20th century, they talk about how in the 19th century people became basically more civilized, and that's why some of these place names disappeared. But I think there's also another factor at play, and that's essentially capitalism, and we can see that much more clearly today. So for example, as houses essentially become commodities that people want to buy and sell, no one wants to try and sell a house on a place called Misery Hill or Mount Misery. And that's why you get a lot of very bland place names in the Irish landscape today, where essentially they have no meaning whatsoever, but they're not in any way going to affect the house price. And I think that's a big factor in all this. Finally, I will say some of the place names do survive because they're relatively innocuous or they've lost their meaning. So for example, I mentioned Love Lanes. They can survive in the landscape today because the history is not as explicit in the place name. Finally, there is one place that I didn't mention at all that I meant to mention earlier on, and this is fascinating. So there used to be a place in Dublin called Hell, and it was located right beside Christchurch. And actually in the past, in this lane in Dublin called Hell, there was actually a wooden carving of the devil as you walked into Hell. Now, where that place name Hell comes from is the subject of a lot of debate. Maybe it's related to some of those more notorious place names I mentioned earlier in Dublin, although I did come across a fascinating reference that might point in a completely different direction. So Hell in Dublin was located up around where Christchurch Cathedral is today, but in the past that's where the main courts complex of the city was located. And in Westminster in London, again where the courts were located in the city, there was also a lane there called Hell. And in one source that I was looking at preparing for this video, they were speculating that there may be some connection between the courts and this place named Hell, which is absolutely intriguing. Now, before I finish the video today, I'd love to hear from you about place names in your local area that have maybe a more macabre history. I've only scratched the surface in this video. And also, just before I go, don't forget to check out the Irish History podcast. At the moment, I'm doing that series on the 1798 rebellion. It's a really great story of the largest revolt in Irish history. It took place, obviously, in the summer of 1798, but there's a really great history behind that. Do check that out. I have it linked beneath this video. And finally, if you've got this far, do subscribe to the channel. I make videos every week on different aspects of Irish history, and I'm preparing a couple of great videos in the next coming weeks. So to get them, just subscribe. It really helps in the algorithm. And also give this video a like and drop a comment if you do have any of your own place names. Even if they're not in Ireland, I'd love to hear them because I'm absolutely fascinated by the history of place names. I'll be talking to you soon. Until then, so long.